Hey everyone, so as we move on from the causes of the Cold War and looking at containment in the Cold War and a couple of examples of that, we're going to continue delving deeper into this rivalry that was taking place between the Soviet Union and the United States, specifically in the 1950s and 1960s. So as we mentioned before, the Cold War was really a period of an intense rivalry and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II and ending in about 1991. And so because we have this competition with the Soviet Union and because we don't know if this is going to end up in a war, this is really a time period that's characterized by political, ideological, military competitions as both superpowers seek to win out in this competition. And so during the era of the 1950s and 1960s, we start seeing this competition spread in terms of an arms race. So who's going to build the most powerful weapons, who's going to build the most weapons, especially when it comes to like nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons. You also have a space race, who's going to be dominating the final frontier as they talk about. So who's going to be the first one to the moon? Who's going to be the first one who can orbit the Earth? Who's the first one who will get to Mars and other things from the space race? And then also in the middle of this, we have decolonization happening in Africa and Asia, in which colonized powers, as we talked about several units ago, they are now starting to become independent and free countries. And so each of this is going to sort of come into the scope of the Cold War and really interrupt some things and really be influenced by these things. So a couple things first, though. In terms of the United States, as we talked about last class, there was really a fear of communism and the spread of communism into America. And the first term we're going to talk about here is the term of McCarthyism. So this just refers to the practice of making accusations of someone being a communist and committing treason without proper regard for evidence. And this really comes from a time period in the United States in the 1950s in which a senator by the name of Joseph McCarthy, he was from Wisconsin, ended up leading a campaign in the United States. And he ended up saying that what he knew of, thousands of communists who worked for the government, and that he, through interrogating them and really persecuting a lot of people, would find these people out because they posed such a grave threat to the United States. And so this period, was sort of interwoven with a time known as the Red Scare, due to the amount of fear, the amount of paranoia that was surrounding the spread of communism. And over time, McCarthy ends up being found out to be a fraud. He really did not have any evidence of the numbers of communists that he felt were in the government. He was lying in a lot of ways. And because of this time, he ends up becoming discredited. He ends up dying of alcoholism just only a couple years after this time period. However, the name of McCarthyism sort of lives on when we were talking about this time period in which so many people lost their livelihoods because they were unfairly, said to be communists. Now, in addition to this era of McCarthyism, the U.S. Congress also set up a committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee, and that was called HUAC. So this is a congressional committee that was established to investigate alleged disloyalty and subversive activities. So not only do you have people like Joseph McCarthy leading this campaign, but you also have additional committees set up to stop the spread of communism. Now, in the middle of all of this, you also have a couple that was accused of spying for the Soviets and giving them atomic secrets from the Americans. And their names were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And the Rosenbergs became very, very famous, or infamous, as I should say, because they were found to be spies. Now, even though over the course of time there were some questions about whether they were actually spies, recent evidence has shown that they were actually spies and that they were actually giving information over to the Soviets that allowed them to prepare and to make an atomic weapon. And they were eventually executed for treason in 1953. And so this really, highlights sort of the fears that were going on with the Red Scare, even though there were a couple sort of instances in which there were people found to be spies for the Soviets or found to be communists. This was, very far and few between, although there's a couple famous examples like the Rosenbergs, like I just talked about, that actually did sort of exemplify this threat that might be caused by the Soviets. Now, in the middle of all of this now, we, in terms of the Red Scare, in terms of the Rosenbergs, in terms of McCarthyism and everything else going on, the fears were sort of ratcheted up from the American side when the Soviets were able to develop a hydrogen bomb. And this was first tested in 1951 by the Soviet Union. And this sort of escalated this arms race that would start. The Soviets had tested an atomic weapon in 1949. And for the Americans, this was really scary because they thought they were the only ones who had this capability to be able to do it. But the reason why the hydrogen bomb was so significant was because this was a thermonuclear weapon. And this was significantly more powerful than the atomic bombs that we had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. And so this is starting to represent really a dangerous advancement in nuclear technology. And this is going to have the possibility for a scale that we can't even imagine. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombs, were very, very deadly, very, very devastating. And so to think about a weapon that is even more powerful than that is something that's, something we have to avoid. And so what ends up coming out of this is not only a arms race, I should say, in which the Soviet Union and the United States are competing to up their technology so that they have as strong a weapons as possible, especially in comparison to the other side. But also there's this concept that starts coming out, and it's this concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And mutually assured destruction just meant that, and it sort of kept the two sides from actually fighting each other, because if a fight actually broke out and nuclear weapons would be dropped on each other, well, then we're both destroying each other. We are assuring that both of us are going to be destroyed. And so that really doesn't help anyone if both nations are completely wiped out. And so, in a lot of ways, the development of these stronger nuclear weapons ended up having sort of a cooling effect on tensions, because neither one wanted to really face the idea that we were going to be annihilating each other and promising annihilation of ourselves. And the arms race that ends up developing, it also had significant economic implications. Because of this arms race, the United States and the Soviet Union both invest vast sums of money into nuclear weapons programs so that they can, again, defeat the other side. And so what ends up happening is that resources are taken away from things like social welfare, from infrastructure, from building the things that we need in our country, like roads and bridges, and continuing to up society in that way, and instead goes towards military, defense, weapons research, those sorts of things that are going to help us in terms of defeating the Soviet Union. So there's a bit of a catch-22, or a weighing out process of what effects this actually had. And another thing that ends up causing another competition between the Soviet Union and the United States was the development by the Soviets of the first satellite, the first artificial satellite that would orbit the planet. This was Sputnik, and this was created in 1957, and it marked the beginning of the space race. So we have an arms race developed, really started by the fact that the Soviets now had nuclear technology, and now we have the space race. And this competition between the US and the Soviet Union to explore outer space and to begin to dominate this final frontier of space became a symbol of technological prowess and also ideological superiority. Depending on who is going to win these races, you could sort of say our side works. Either communism works or capitalism works better than the other side. And so throughout the space race, both the United States and the Soviet Union ended up achieving many milestones that, demonstrated huge steps forward for humanity. The Soviets were the first to launch a human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. And then they were also, the United States, on the other hand, through this space race, were able to put the first humans on the moon. And they were also able to put the first unmanned spacecraft on Mars in 1971. And really, these represented huge technological achievements that could not have been thought possible even 50 years before that. And so these pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible in space exploration, leading to today where we have discovered more galaxies and planets than we thought possible. It really ups and fueled advancements in science and technology that, again, we just did not think were possible at that time. Now, along with this, and because of the fears of where the Soviets were at in terms of technological domination, in response to this, the U.S. passed what they called the National Defense Education Act. And this was designed to improve education in science, mathematics, and also foreign languages, because that was such a huge part of trying to understand what the Soviets were doing. And one of the key provisions of the NDEA, or National Defense Education Act, was the allocation of funds to improve and expand educational programs at all levels, so from elementary school to college. And so this would include financial assistance for students pursuing higher education in various fields that were thought necessary for national security, scholarships, loans, fellowships. These were made available to talented individuals to help them pursue these degrees. They also wanted to establish the first student loan program, which would provide low interest loans to students pursuing higher education. And this could be in a lot of different fields. They also wanted to improve teaching and teacher education programs to ensure that all students were receiving the most highly qualified education possible. And this provided grants to universities and schools to develop and enhance curriculum materials for science and mathematics education in particular, and then also improving the teaching of foreign languages. And so this really helped us focus and strengthen education in a lot of ways, but it also changed what we focused on with education towards more science and mathematics. And so all of this, would help to hopefully aim and foster a better understanding of cultures, languages, regions, in addition to promoting, our knowledge of what the Soviets were doing and what other countries might be doing as well. Now, the last major concept that I want to talk about right here is decolonization. And so we've talked about colonization and imperialism throughout the last half of this year. And we talked about how so many African nations, so many Asian nations, so many nations in the Caribbean as well, were under the control of many European countries. And at the same time as the Cold War, many African and Asian nations started to seek independence for themselves from colonial rule. And decolonization, before we start off, just refers to the process by which colonies are able to gain their independence from their ruling powers and become independent nations of their own. And a lot of this boiled down to what was going on in Europe after World War II. Because World War II and World War I before it were so destructive, a lot of European powers were weakened economically, and their ability to really hold on to these nations and control them in the same ways that they were before were weakened by this. And so this created an opportunity for colonies in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean to push for their independence. Some of these we've already talked about. We talked about Vietnam, we talked about Korea last week, and Vietnam was able to break free from the French, and the US got involved really after that as Vietnam started to turn towards communism for their independence and what they would be ruled by in this new independent country. But a lot of other African nations were starting to become decolonized as well. They were starting to become independent on their own. And for the Cold War, this is important because the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union, viewed this as another way to sort of compete with each other and find greater influence throughout. If you could help these new nations become independent, then you had an additional country that would favor you and might become democratic over communist or vice versa. And so, this really became a way in which the US and the Soviet Union competed. And one key aspect of this was the strategic importance of these new independent states, and the will or the want to seek the allegiance of these nations. So they might provide economic and military aid to these countries, things that we still do today, giving money to other countries to make sure that they continue to hopefully find stability as a country, and we can find influence of our own. And the Cold War also fueled conflicts in former colonies that were struggling to gain independence. So in many of these cases, these conflicts would become sort of proxy wars where we would back one side, the Soviets would back another, just like what happened in Korea and Vietnam with those two wars. To smaller degrees. And the United States and the Soviet Union would do this, and unfortunately the legacy of these conflicts would create greater division within the countries that they were attempting to quote-unquote help or quote-unquote find to their side. And so the effects of these things created long-term division within those countries that can still be felt today. Some of the fighting and civil wars that are still going on in Africa, these are a result not only of colonization, but also of what was going on during the Cold War as they attempted to find themselves as a new nation. So here's just a couple of pictures right here. You can see on the left just the years of independence for a lot of these nations that were breaking away from their different rulers like Great Britain and France and Italy and Belgium and Portugal and Spain. And then on the right, you can see sort of some of the breakdowns for who became allies of the United States, who became allies of the Soviet Union. And within Africa, this became sort of a battleground for these two countries as they competed. So as we close, the arms race and the space race in the context of the Cold War were really pivotal aspects in the struggle for supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union. And these developments, along with decolonization, really pushed this rivalry to the next level and really helped to shape the international relations, how countries got along with each other during really this significant period in history. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know. But other than that, I hope everyone has a great day.